I'm here for you, right?
That's a cut. Beautiful. Acting is one thing. Talking about suicide in real life is another.
In the military, you take challenges head on.
And now it's your
So
turn.
we're listening to the. Good morning, Frank. How are you?
How you doing?
Good.
We've got about 2 minutes here.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to call in early enough so that it wasn't too close.
Yeah, sure.
So for those of you on Facebook, we're going to be talking about defunding the police today on the radio show, which is available in Elmira and Corning and surrounding areas, 1450 AM, 1230 AM, and 2 FM stations. I never remember. 106.9 and 103.3 FM in the surrounding area. And so if you're having trouble with sound quality or anything here, or you're traveling and you prefer to listen on radio, tune in there. It turns out that defunding the police is not what anybody thinks it is. So the left doesn't get what they want, the right doesn't get what they want. I've looked at cities that have done it. Camden, for example, did this in 2012, and it's been really interesting. So we're going to talk about that today. So just be patient until the radio show starts, and we'll be off the races. How much longer, Frank?
We're just about to go on right now. Okay, your open just started. Okay, go ahead.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Law Talk. Today's Law Talk is going to be about defunding the police. So before we talk about why defunding the police and how that worked out, and there are cities that have tried it, and it's not what the left thinks it's going to be, and it's not what the right thinks it's going to be either. So when it works out in practice, it's interesting. So let me give you some history of policing. I'm an old lady. I'm 59 years old. So 50 years ago, for the police, policing was very different. So it was common for the police to simply drive a drunk driver home. It wasn't considered the huge crime that it's considered now. If there was an accident, even with a drunk driver, it was considered an accident. Mutually voluntary fights like barroom brawls were never prosecuted. It was assumed that if you volunteered to get into a fight with somebody else, then you got whatever it was that you signed up for. Just like in the old days, dueling used to be legal, and if someone wound up dead, well, they agreed to the duel, so there wasn't any murder or homicide charges. Similarly, when I was a girl, if people got into a fight and they both wanted to fight each other, then whatever happened, happened. Family violence was ignored as being a private matter. Sexual abuse of children was either considered very rare or a childhood fantasy or lie, which explains how the churches and the Boy Scouts and everybody, this went on for years and years because nobody believed the children. It was rarely or if ever prosecuted. Neighbors didn't tell on neighbors, and family members didn't turn family members into the police when I was younger. Child support was hard to get and not vigorously enforced. There was no jail for not paying child support. Children were not encouraged in school to report what the state considered child abuse. That was never raised when I was a child. Drug abuse was treated. Sometimes it was treated by locking someone up in what we used to call a mental institution for years and years, because if they got out, they would simply go back to using drugs. So that was how that was handled. So the upside of all of that was that there was far fewer incarceration levels. People often worked out their problems with each other, and children were more often raised in homes with two natural parents. Neighborhoods tended to have more of a sense of community. and the family and what happened in the family was considered none of the government's business. The downside was that spouses could be abused. And if spouses were abused, a woman could tell, usually it was a woman who was abused, a woman could tell her father or her brother, and they would come over and beat up her husband, maybe, if she had a father or a brother, and if they could beat up her husbands. Or I know of one situation that happens actually before I was born, but I was told about it. A husband had hit his wife, and when he went to sleep, she broke his knee with a cast iron frying pan and told him next time it would be his head. And he never hit her again. So that's not the ideal solution, but that's what happened. There was no prosecution. The police never knew any of that happened. Child abuse was generally unpunished, not because people were okay with it, though beating a child for misbehavior was not universally frowned upon, but it was assumed that parents loved their children and would do what was best for them, and if the child said otherwise, they were lying. After alcohol prohibition failed, society understood that trying to stop people from ingesting their chosen poison didn't work and only encouraged organized crime and promoted the violence associated with organized crime. So we've come a long way from then till now. We've seen with the decriminalization of marijuana, when law abiding people are allowed to grow pot, there's no incentive for organized crime or the violence that goes with it. Drug abuse is a medical problem and it's not cured with incarceration. The government loses billions in tax dollars because people who participate in organized crime don't pay taxes on that money. And if they try to pay taxes on that money by pretending it comes from a legitimate source and pay taxes on it, that's a crime too, called money laundering. So we make it difficult for people in illegal activities to pay their taxes even if they want to. So what's the new vision about defunding the police, and what does it mean and what does it look like? Well, as I said at the top of the show, it's not so very new because Camden, New Jersey has done it, and we're going to get into the results of that in a bit. But what they mean by this depends on who you ask. The supporters really want to see the money that is taken from defunding the police, and defunding can mean cutting their budgets or it can mean eliminating them entirely. Camden eliminated their police force entirely. And the idea is that the money from this will go from the police and sort of harsher punishments for things that go wrong in society to social services. However, in none of the cities that I looked at was I able to see any demonstration or any proof that the money actually went to social services. So, or, youth recreation programs or whatever else they're talking about. So when you're talking about defunding the police and all kinds of promises are made about what's going to happen to this money, just know that there's no assurance that what they promise you is actually going to happen because budget decisions are separate. There are separate lines on the budget. And just because they say if we defund the police, we're going to fund all these other wonderful programs, doesn't mean that's actually going to happen. The budget process is different. And so it's up to a lot of negotiation. And so it doesn't always happen the way people think it's going to happen. They may not be lying. I'm not saying politicians never lie, but I'm saying they may sincerely in their hearts believe that they want to defund the police and put the money towards other programs. But like other promises politicians make, it takes the cooperation of the other people on the city board or the county legislature or whatever it is. They all have to agree on these budget things, and it's not going to happen just because some people want it to happen that way. But the people who want to defund the police want to go with a completely different model of community-led safety. And so who you ask, it's a spectrum depending on who you ask and what their plans are. It also, at its core, though, means dismantling the idea that the police are the stewards of public safety because people of color and the communities of color tell us that they don't feel safer with the police, whereas white people like myself, I tend to think of the police as my friend. If I'm in trouble, I call the police and they're going to help me. But not everyone in our society views the police in the same way. They don't see necessarily the police as being there to help them so much as fear of what the police might do because of the color of their skin. So it's a different point of view and it's a different mindset. So certainly it's understandable that people would want to defund the police if they feel oppressed by the police. But the important thing to consider before we do this is what actually happens when you defund the police and what happens. So one of the things that people wanted to do to change police culture was to have the body cameras. So the police would wear body cameras, and then it would be very clear from the body cameras whether or not there was any police brutality, what happened before and after, And that doesn't really work unless the police have the body cameras on all the time. And sometimes we get this sort of selective body camera footage where the police are able to turn on the body camera when they want to and turn it off. So it's not always the great panacea that people thought it would be, although it has been very helpful in many cases in showing what happened when there were different versions. Now, of course, if something happens in public, there's often a crowd with a bunch of phones out taking video. But when things happen in a more private place, that's not always the case. So, what are we talking about when we talk about defunding the police? Well, there have always been, for example, county sheriffs and others like that, and they would be elected and they would be answerable to the people, and then they would police, so to speak, with the deputies, and that was the police. So, how did city and village police departments get started? Well, they got started as slave patrols. They would go after runaway slaves. So we can understand how communities of color might feel like from the very beginning, community policing in the form of town and city police were specifically organized to target people of color. So that's not a good history to start out with. So part of what people are talking about is sending the policing back to the elected official, back to somebody who has to answer to the public. So, for example, the chief of police in a city is often not an elected position, and certainly not in smaller towns. But sheriffs are an elected position. So if you don't like the way the sheriff is sheriffing, somebody can run against them, and they can be voted out. So that's a good thing. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that when we come back. This is Law Talk.
Pain or no pain, you're
Okay, how much time do I have in the next segment?
you have about 8.5.
Okay.
Your rejoin's just about to start.
Okay.
All right, go ahead.
So, where has this been tried before, and what have the results been as far as defunding the police or having less police presence? Well, in New York City, in a few weeks between 2014 and 2015, the police department purposely pulled back on proactive policing. And I'm not sure whether that was part of a negotiation strategy with the union or what was going on, but they pulled back. And as it turned out, there were 2,100 fewer crime complaints during those several weeks as compared to the year before. Minneapolis has said that they're going to defund the police. They have voted to slash between 100 million and 150 million from the proposed funding in California. And that's what we need to talk about as far as follow the money. So some people have said, well, what are these towns and cities crazy? They're going to do without a police force? No, they're going to save a ton of money. What they're going to do is disband their police forces. And then, of course, policing has to happen. So what happens? The burden falls on the state police and on the county sheriff's department. So these towns and cities are going to save a boatload of money. They've been spending a boatload of money on the public health that they were not anticipating was not in their budget. So it's not so surprising when you follow the money that the cities and municipalities are in favor of defunding the police. Perhaps not so much because of the reasons that are given by peaceful protesters, but perhaps because the money then gets saved and they don't have to spend it and it's not a part of their budget. So again, the part of the, supposed caving into the left or whatever is really a kind of a neat way for cities to get out of spending this and towns to get out of spending this massive amount of money that they've been spending, throw the money, the debt, the problem on the counties and on the state, And then they can just kind of throw up their hands and say, well, that's what the people wanted. They didn't want a local police force. We don't have one. And, so now the problem is somebody else's. So tightening the police department budget or any government budget isn't a bad idea, because a lot of times there's some extra money in there that isn't necessary. But let's talk about Camden. I did a little bit of teasing in the beginning about Camden, New Jersey, and what they did. And so it disbanded its 141-year-old police department in 2012, just completely disbanded it. In its place, the counties that surrounded it formed a new police department, and it went on to expand to jurisdictions outside the city and outside the county, and it was all one big police department. So they rehired most of the laid off workers, along with nearly 100 more officers. So they wound up with more officers and more police, not less. But they paid them much lower salaries. So they disbanded the police department. The union that represented the Camden City Police Department was disbanded, and they saved about $90,000 per officer by doing this. So again, if you follow the money, you may conclude, or you may suspect, that the reason they disbanded was not so much to be friendlier to the community, but because it saved them a boatload of money. So strapped budgets have pushed municipalities to consider consolidating anyway, joining police forces, sharing resources. So this push to defund the police plays right into the hands of the people in the municipalities and cities that want to cut budgets in a big way. You could never get away with eliminating a police department in any other time or in any other way, but when you have people marching in the streets insisting on it, then it seems like you're listening to your people when you're saving a boatload of money. So you're not going to do away with law enforcement altogether. The responsibility is going to go to the sheriff's department or to the state police. It's not going to go away. So when Camden disbanded its police force and dissolved the local police union, which seems to be what Minneapolis is going on too, they found out that there were more police on the street because they hired more police because they were paying them less, so they were able to hire more police. So if the goal of defunding the local police departments, the municipal and city police departments, is to have fewer police on the street, the opposite actually happens when it was tried. Okay, so you didn't wind up with fewer police on the street, you wound up with more police on the street. In addition, because the police officers were from a wider area, they were not as many police officers of color as there were before. When the Camden had its own police force, they drew from the neighborhoods in Camden. And so the police officer was not only a police officer, but they were your neighbor. When the policing went to a wider area, county-wide area and outside the county, you wound up with 40% more white police officers policing neighborhoods of color, which I think is probably the opposite of what the protesters want. So you wind up, practically speaking, when this has been tried on a large scale, long term, you wound up with more police officers on the street, getting paid a lot less money, and there were fewer officers of color patrolling neighborhoods of color. This was the result in Camden, and you can certainly look this up. Now, one of the good things that happened in Camden, though, when they laid the police officers off before they rehired them, they made them all undergo psychological tests. So anybody who was, they thought might be prone to commit police brutality, they did not rehire. So most of the police got rehired, but some of them didn't. So that's probably a good thing. But again, this is a form of union busting. So the police union costs a lot of money. And so if you dissolve the whole police force, no reason for the police union, for that police force to exist, and therefore it doesn't. So the critics criticize this defunding and this reorganizing everything is really a way of union busting. And I think they're probably right. Again, you look at people across the country and you say, what are these towns and these cities thinking? Well, they're thinking they're going to save a lot of money. They're going to get rid of the police unions. And oh yeah, by the way, this seems to be what some of the people want anyway. So they can say this is what the people wanted. So for Camden residents, there was not a lesser police or less policing for things that maybe weren't necessary to involve the police for, but there were actually more police. The officers were making more traffic stops and issuing more tickets for minor violations. They were citing bicyclists for failing to have a bell on their bicycle or other, audible device, a horn or something. So there was a lot of things going on there that just wasn't what people wanted at all. When they were saying defund the police, get rid of the city police department, they didn't mean send us more police who don't look like us and we'll start writing tickets for even more minor things than people had done before. But that was the experience in Camden. So when people say they want something, it's really good to have a really good plan as to how to do this. And there wasn't any evidence that there was more funding. All this money, the $90,000 per officer that they saved, they, and by and large, hired more officers at lower salaries, and it didn't go into recreational programs and social services. There was nothing that I could find that said it did, and there was nothing I could find that said that cities that defunded the police put the money into social services and kumbaya, here's what happened. So that seems to be an empty promise or a thought of that's probably not realistic. And the argument the police made for, issuing citations for tinted windows and things like that in Camden was that armed robbery suspects often drive cars with tinted windows. Drug dealers deploy lookouts on bikes. So they tended to go after these very minor things, thinking that this was the way they were going to improve policing. So getting rid of the local police department actually did not bring about any of the things that the people were hoping for. Um, Again, the makeup of the new police department was more suburban. It was whiter than the old city police department. More than 2/3 of the former department's officers were minorities and people of color. Not so with the new police department, as it was expanded, like I said, to the whole county. You then could draw on the whole county, and so that you did not have police that looked like the people who were there. And so it's time for another break, and then we are going to come back with Law Talk.
All right, so you'll have again about 8.5 minutes.
Okay, did you know all of that, Frank? Because I didn't know it until this morning.
No, not at all.
It's like they say, follow the money.
Exactly,
Like everything.
All right, 1 minute.
Okay.
All right, your rejoin's just about to start here.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
So we're talking today on Law Talk about defunding the police and how that worked out in Camden, New Jersey, and how it didn't work out. And the reason why Camden, New Jersey decided to defund its police department in 2012, it was strictly budgetary. At the time, Governor Christie was governor of New Jersey, and he was encouraging the local municipalities to disband their police departments and start countywide police departments. So in Camden, New Jersey, they decided, okay, we'll do this, and so they saved the money and they tossed some money to the countywide police department. But like I said, they saved $90,000 per officer just by disbanding their police department and going with the county police. The other municipalities in Camden weren't so quick to do that. So one of the reasons a lot of the county police wound up in Camden, New Jersey, and they wound up with more police instead of fewer police and more recreational facilities or whatever, was that none of the other municipalities took Governor Christie up on his offer to have a strong county police force and roll that all in together and share services, et cetera, et cetera. So there's been a problem with getting everybody on board. Lots of times people want to protect their turf, and so the duplication of services wasn't really eliminated, certainly not right away. And the state legislators wanted people to share municipalities to share services, and this seemed like an obvious way to do this. So Camden didn't wind up doing this because of any community concerns or protests or anything like that in 2012. It was strictly a budgetary move, and there was no dispute about that. That is exactly what it was. It was a budgetary move. So the reason why it would be normal and appropriate, I think, to wonder if the reason why it's being done that way now and so many people are jumping on board across the country is because they can save a whole lot of money in their budgets and say, oh, this is what the people wanted. You know, we're elected to do what the people want. And they didn't want the police force anymore. Then push that off again on the county or the state. So that's the kind of thing that's been going on. So we need to understand that when we're defunding the police, again, we're not talking necessarily about funding other things. Now, Camden had a really long-term crime problem, and the police force wasn't necessarily able to reduce the violence and such. They had 175 open-air drug markets at one point when the change went over. And they gained it. Camden had a reputation as a drug hub, not surprisingly, attracting buyers from surrounding suburbs and as far away from New York City. Non-residents made up 80% of Camden, New Jersey's drug arrests. So people were coming in to Camden to buy drugs. There's also a lot of blight. Abandoned and decayed buildings have been taken up as headquarters by people who are involved in organized crime. We like to call them gangs, but whatever you call them. So there they were. And the city went around raising or trying to seal up empty structures, which prevented the gangs from using those particular locations as headquarters, but didn't really prevent the gangs from doing business. It did stop homeless people from getting shelter in the winter in those abandoned buildings. There was all kinds of garbage and other problems. They can spend hours searching for evidence among the litter, looking for the needles or the drug stash or whatever among the garbage. The the city of Camden has a high concentration of young adults, and a disproportionate amount are poor and unemployed. The last census estimated that 39% of the city residents live in poverty, which is the fourth highest rate nationwide. So it's no surprise when people are living in poverty and there are no jobs that they turn to the drug trade. So it's just, there's a lot more that needs to be done than defunding the police. And if the money had gone into the social services that are needed, that may have helped. But there's no real evidence that it did that. So community activists in Camden argue that disbanding the force didn't substantially change policing. They were saying, well, the narrative that this is what the people wanted is a lie. Most of the people did not want that. Most of the people were happy with the police force and wished that they would do their job. And they wanted a police force that looked like them, which in Camden they largely had, but that changed when the local police union was defunded, dissolved, and the police force was defunded. So you had worse working conditions for the police. They were making less money. They were getting fewer benefits, and they were looking less like the communities that they were policing. So it was a difficult, a difficult transition, and not necessarily a wholehearted success. Where it was a success is that it saved money for the municipality that joined in it. Camden, New Jersey, saved a lot of money by defunding the police and dissolving the union. So there's a premise in defunding the police and in the peaceful protesters call for that. And when I say peaceful protesters, I'm not calling all of the protesters or looters peaceful. I'm saying the people who are genuinely peaceful protesters who want change is what I'm talking about. The premise is that police are bad and social science is good. But if you look at what social services is, I mean, they run the food stamp program and the housing programs and the child protective programs. And so if you want more of that kind of, certainly with child protective and others, you know, that there seems to be some sort of real problem with the way that they're run and the people that they target. And, you know, I'm sure that they save lives and prevent some child abuse, But as an attorney who deals with them on a regular basis, I can tell you it's just a complete question mark to me. Some of the people that they allow children to go back to, and some of the people that they don't. So if you have more of that, you're going to have more of that kind of question, that kind of perhaps unfairness or unevenness in the way things are enforced, because social workers are not necessarily going to be doing things uniformly, and of course, every situation is different. So the defund discussion needs to be broadened to talk about, well, what comes next? And what the people are saying they want to come next are, community treatment for drugs and youth centers and recreation centers and all of that. But that's just not where the money went. That's just not where the money went when people defunded the police. And so we have to, if we're going to do something like this in cities across the country, then there needs to be some sort of real program or plan that, all right, so for every dollar you take out of the police department, you're going to put a dollar into this. And that's going to be really hard to enforce for the people on the ground, because again, there's in most legislatures there's a budget committee. The budget committee has a bunch of private meetings where they try to hash out what's what and what's going to get funded. And then they go before the entire legislature, the legislative body, and then they explain why they did what's what. And if the legislature wants any changes, they tweak it, and then they bring it to the people. Sometimes, or sometimes you just have to take whatever they do. So we're out of time on Law Talk, but follow the money. Have a good week. Bye bye.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. I think that was a good show.
Yep. I think it was good. Talk to you next week.
See you next week. Bye bye.
Bye.
So that's Frank Acombe. He's my producer. He has the only other original show. Law Talk and Frankly Speaking, Frank's show, are the only two shows that are originally produced on my station. They just have gone all to syndicated programming. So if you want to support local programming, then you need to support Frank and I in our endeavor. We are commercial radio, and so we have commercials in it. There is no longer any Federal Communication Commission requirement that you do a public benefit program or local public benefit programming, because the internet, and there are so many other sources with cable of getting local news that you don't need to do that. So I just think it's an interesting little factoid that Frank and I are the only locally produced radio programs on our station at this time. Everything else you hear is just mass market consumption stuff. So anyway, thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next week.